The impetus for this paper came last year in Berlin when there seemed to be in the pre-conference discussions by email a big split between the return to class group and the intersectionality group. And so I found myself wanting to keep class and do intersectionality. So that's what happened with this particular introduction. In cutting it for this session, I found, much to my dismay, that I cut 10 pages out of specific groups in various places around the globe whom I love and I think are doing wonderful work, very important work. And so I stand before you feeling like a murderer that I cut all these wonderful groups out. And I'm very happy to talk about them if we get the chance, or better yet, to send you a copy of the paper with all those wonderful groups in, and then you can read for yourself. These lesbian-led organizations and their communities are not only taking the brunt of reactionary neoliberal attacks, masquerading as populist movements while gutting public assets for private profit, but globally contemporary organizations are also consciously organizing against the owning classes. They're banking Ponzi schemes, as Varoufakis called the European Union loans gifted to Greek banks, which sustain austerity and the right. These groups around the world are building bridges with progressive alliances to resist neoliberalism and to shape a more equitable and hopefully more sustainable society. Neoliberalism, intersectionality, and lesbian movement. I'm Tucker Pamela Farley. In the 70s, some Marxist feminists were still arguing that lesbians should stand back because we skewed the women's movement. But globally, lesbian-led feminism has provided consistent and effective leadership in movement building and activism for structural change on all levels to advance gender, racial, economic, and social, and with indigenous movements, environmental justice. I'm sorry, thank you. These movements globally have been building bridges with progressive allies. It's encouraging that diverse strands of our movement are now coming together. We need to work together. With more time, I would argue that the more radical LGBT and two-spirit people, two-spirit is a term that's used in North America at least to refer to indigenous people, native peoples, and people, native nations, who are lesbian, gay, transgender, or some cultural version of that difference. Along with native tribes and nations as protectors of the environment globally, in the forefront of resistance to extractive neoliberal imperialist capitalism. I reflect on, briefly but here omit, how the activist lesbian feminist movement from the late 60s on, in the initial stages of the second wave of feminism, in its growing pains, and in its recent developments in the US and globally, has provided impetus and insights to the development of the current international feminist practice of intersectionality, what we now call intersectionality. I find that the early insights of the lesbian movement have contributed significantly to understanding how race, class, gender, and other defining factors of the people in movement have developed. I situate that lineage in the growing shift of capital from one stage to another, where the intersectional models of organizing for social change fit the latest stage of global financialization, constituting a new stage of the social structure of capital, the SSA. In this stage, I argue that calling on and working with multiply constituted disaffected groups is appropriate for Marxist feminists. You remember the Combahee River Collective stated that there was no person on earth that had only race but no class or gender or any other combination, that everybody always had all of them, and all of them came to bear in people's lives and in their movements. All work together in various ways in multiple constructions of oppressive power relations, and, as they claim, the most oppressed should lead. The visionary call for an inclusive revolutionary movement to forge a new world which has come from the most despised is an inspiration for those of us faced with building new bridges and renewed movement. Movement building pressures led to more effective and more inclusive movement groups and communities. I am omitting but noting an example of the operation of this expansion in education, which transforms the category of women and of lesbian inclusively that occurred in Latin America in 2010, around the meeting of the largest summit of lesbian feminist activists in Latin America and the entire world, the Encuentro Lésbico Feminista de Latin America y el Caribe. Isolated groups establishing themselves in urban centers around the world find strength in connecting with others in their region and then internationally. The International Resource Network has grown so rapidly, itself a political force, that it has become possible to move quickly into organizing from centers to regional groupings and national organizations, as with the Lalas. Lalas is the term in China for lesbians, bisexual, and trans people. And in a short period of time, in less than a decade, their work has transformed the movements in that country, in that region. Allies who have supported youth organizations across the U.S. are reaching out to support queer youth organizations in the Global South and East, in Chile, China, Colombia, Jamaica, Lebanon, and Nigeria. Organizations have benefited from the inclusiveness of human rights work and the international campaign Women's Rights are Human Rights, building a network that spans the globe. I mention many of these because oftentimes people don't read about them, don't know about them, don't see them in the media, and so I just want to bring them into visibility, even though I've cut them and they're in my 10 pages of cut work. Often, victories have brought with them backlash, pushing movements into different stages of struggle. For example, India's overturning in 2009 the colonial law criminalizing same-sex relations has been met since then with an increase in violence against perceived transgression of sexual or gender norms. As hundreds of people met to resist this, the disability justice, sex worker, trans and lesbian movements across South Asia met together in a historic movement, a movement building project in 2011. The backlash forces more resistance and the movement grows. In South Africa, where the conditions in legal terms are probably the most progressive in the world for women and the other, for the conditions on the ground are not. And in building a way to deal with that, the South African women formed the Forum for the Empowerment of Women. Organizations have benefited from the inclusiveness of human rights work, beginning with the international campaign Women's Rights are Human Rights. You remember that the 2 decades of conferences on women around the globe ended with international organization on that slogan. That movement has been useful on every continent, both on the local, regional, and national levels, culminating in work at the huge international UN conferences on women for 2 decades, building a network that spans the globe. While national and international victories are significant, it is the victories in communities that build the movement for a long haul of social change. In New York City, for example, an exemplary organization is the Audre Lorde Project, developing response to immediate needs with long-term politics, supporting class and intersectional projects addressing multiple oppressions. Increasingly, this intersectional approach is being explicitly adopted worldwide, for as Audre Lorde Project says, there is no way you can deal with only one oppression in this society. Each one intersects with others. According to ALP, we have to deal with the whole, but that is a long-term project, and we keep our work responsive to those on the bottom. Lesbian-led groups around the globe are active, largely imperiled, often together with allied progressives who also risk their lives working together, and always embattled on the front line against neoliberal regimes, patriarchal slaughter, corrective rape, lobotomy, imprisonment, and other forms, including death by state law in Uganda, achieved by Christian proselytizing, only recently through work with allies reduced the penalty to life imprisonment. Amazingly, the most rapacious and murderous regimes directed against LGBT movements and their allies in the far reaches of the globe, on continent after continent, can seem invisible when hegemonic lenses like those constructed by media are used to survey the scene or ignore it. Fortunately, the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission has, for a decade or more, detailed crimes in most of the nations of the world. We will need to look at what lenses we use to see at what oppressive regimes we need to fight and at the range of our allies in the systemic struggle. What are the implications for organizing from here? In the last half-century, extremist, well-funded right-wing Christian organizations, largely from the US, have been organizing around the globe, especially in more impoverished countries, where deadly reactionary movements have become active, impelling LGBT movements to make progressive alliances to counter how reactionary movements, which appear today to be more and more in the ascendancy, sow discord and division, violence and disease and distraction, cloaking neoliberal theft of public resources. Lesbian-led organizations have been forming partnerships to contend with the oppression of fundamentalist ideologies intruding around the globe into state affairs, civil society, and community life from Hong Kong to Indonesia to Turkey to the Honduras. Groups are combining of their own core work in sexual rights and gender justice advocacy with broader efforts to develop or restore a secular society. Their goal of broad social change has brought them into working alignment with human rights and progressive organizations. The result has been collaborative efforts that strengthen both movements as each learns to support the others. I omit here examples in Nicaragua, the Philippines, the USA's so-called culture wars. There is clear evidence that the elements of the so-called culture wars against LGBTO and Native American two-spirited peoples have been constructed and function as substantive patriarchal smokescreens of the neoliberal regime, generating a right-wing neo-populist base that distracts from successful organizing against the neoliberal theft of vast wealth transferred through privatization from public assets and resources into private hands. This theft has been marked by a systemic rollback of workers' rights and benefits won through hard-fought struggle during the post-war welfare state hiatus in the unfettered ascendancy of capital, which also in the post-war epoch enabled some health and environmental protections, a bleeding progress in the liberation of women and oppressed minorities who therefore continue to grow and organize globally. The resulting massive reactionary backlash against the progress of the 60s and 70s, combined with an enabling and deindustrialization and globalization with shifting workforces, a systemic privatizing and austerity-demanding heist, has successfully resulted for capitalism in a shift of the social structure of capital accumulation. The capitalist system has shifted from a reliance on industrial production and heavy industry in one country to an increasingly global financialization in the production of wealth. Capitalized pressure for diminished resources leads both to dispossessed farmers and workers and huge displaced populations from increased war zones, called the immigrant problem. Disappearing are the securities of welfare state, state regulation of key industries and the macroeconomy, trade unions, and hard-won national accommodations to the people, and in their place, the voracious international and national monetary instruments that direct wealth to the top. Austerity, debt, and disaster create unheard of wealth for the 1%, while the basis of life on Earth and the vitality of the planet itself are attacked and ignored along with its people, in a defense of patriarchal heteronormativity, increasingly in the form of repressive states at war with modernity, democracy, women, and the gays, the poor, and the environment itself. This regime extracts profits more from creating long-term debt and the takeover of hitherto public functions such as schools, military operations, prisons, and even city planning for profit, removing them from public ownership and control. These conditions give rise to dissatisfaction with the added layers of exploitation and oppression among broad swaths of the people, creating opportunities for resistance and movement building, especially with climate change effects increasing. Such pushback movements have continually arisen in the contemporary period on several continents and may become harbingers of international organizing. As traditional working and farming classes are being deprived of traditional bastions of patriarchal control, the gays are blamed openly, while quietly vast unproductive profits are made globally. Unorganized workers follow this lead for targeting and blaming gays, women, and immigrants, a perfect neoliberal organizing tactic. Centrist and liberal media pundits and sociologists discuss the culture wars, wondering aloud why this swing away from their own self-interest is happening among the working poor. Blaming the gays allows barbarous oppression against us to continue, even as a few hard-won successes come to the fore on hegemonic neoliberalized terms in some countries. Fortunately, there is an increasing number of movement-building lesbian and people of color-led organizations internationally and locally fighting this development with increasing opportunities for alliance. When new regimes of oppression arise, they call into being the forces that resist them and carry on our historic struggles for a more equitable system. This shift in the structure of the capitalist system provides us with the necessity and opportunity to join forces in movement building, including those oppressed groups already in motion regionally and locally, whether students caught in the debt net of the third largest profit-making industry in the U.S., or lesbian-led LGBTQ people of color groups globally who are already fighting for their lives, literally and metaphorically. It's important to note different conditions and struggles globally and regionally to avoid thinking that all lesbians and gays are simply flourishing under neoliberalism, just celebrating acceptance in the military and being married by the state to live happily ever after. On every continent, we can find alliances facilitated by Two-Spirit and lesbian-led organizations. Please ask for my 10 pages of groups. These activists are a small but growing sector that, like the solidarity economy movement, the multifaceted environmental movement, and so many others, are not traditionally considered of importance for a systemic social change if not focused solely on resistance among primary industrial male workers. But the conditions in the activism on the ground indicate a shift. Power relations are multiply constituted and can be resisted in multiple locations and can add up, undermining and resisting the powerful structures calling them into opposition. These rising activists and organizers are progressive social change leaders. Let us join them in coalition building, workers and farmers, women, LGBTQ and Two-Spirit people, racial targets, and the war-torn and impoverished dispossessed, and truly all with a disappearing planet. I have one paragraph. Intersectionality, why not? This question is akin to asking whether organizing those experiencing fundamentally structured shift beyond and in addition to traditional basic industrial production workers, women, LGBT, two-spirit, indigenous, immigrant, movements of color, public servants, dispossessed, starving, ill, imprisoned and ecologically threatened populations, students, homemakers, endangered cities carrying enormous profit-making debt, war-torn and ecologically damaged victims, helps move us to systemic change under finance capitalism. We do not forget or resist traditional class. We join and face a new reality to include other oppressed and exploited victims of profiteering exploitation by doing intersectional organizing for structural change in this new deadly era of finance capitalism. Feminist work in the family, community, health systems, schools, governments, workplaces, environmental movements, we are everywhere, is the heartbeat of the movement for change, addressing inequities, building alternative relations, and working toward building anew.